Okay, well, let's get started. How's the volume? Is that okay? Grab one of these. I tend to migrate a bit, and I'm fairly relaxed, even though we're audio recording this. If you have a clarifying question, please feel free to raise your hand, and then I'll repeat it so that it gets captured on the audio. So I'm Dr. Meghan Davis. You can call me Meghan, and I am the past president of Delta Omega Alpha chapter. And together with the MPH program, every year we sponsor this presentation about how you put a poster together. And so I'm going to be relying a lot on actually training from my mother to teach you about the graphic design. She has a master's in mass communications and graphic design, and the original presentation that we gave together is archived on the Delta Omega Alpha chapter poster competition website. So if you want to Google it, you can listen to straight from the horse's mouth as opposed to my distilled edition on what it takes to put color and font together. So we're going to talk about that graphic design side, and we're also going to talk about some of the technical aspects. This is an appetizer, right? It's not a full course. I only have an hour with you. So if you want to go a little bit deeper, I've listed some resources, and we can certainly follow up. So what are scientific posters? Anybody want to jump in and give me an answer? What would you call a scientific poster? Yes?
It's a poster with scientific information in it.
Okay, so it's a poster, which is what, like a piece of paper or some other fabric that contains scientific information. Okay, what else is a scientific poster? That's good. That's a nice foundational definition.
Well, scientifically, it's usually to present research. So there's usually like certain sections, like I think kind of fits like the sections like of a paper: introduction, methods, results, conclusions.
Correct. So it is a method of providing to an audience some information about the research you're doing, and it has a standardized format, is what I'm hearing from your answer. Anyone want to add? These are both good definitions. Add anything to that? Okay, well maybe you will as we go along. So the art part is really about design and color and font and how you make these difficult choices. And remember, there are many different types of communication, and today we're going to be talking mostly about kind of the visual communication, but understand that there are these additional verbal, nonverbal types of communication that may come into play during a poster presentation. And visual communication includes not just posters, but other kinds of exhibits. Certainly people, if they are working in public health practice, and are trying to make change to various audiences, may need to craft things in very similar ways. You have messaging. PowerPoint presentations, a lot of what I talk about today can be adapted to what you do in a PowerPoint. And then, of course, videos and electronic media are a really emerging way for scientists to communicate, and some of these techniques that we talk about may be adaptable, although I think they're more adaptable to PowerPoint and to other kinds of scientific posters that are not for scientific conferences, but are instead for an audience to try to have behavior change interventions. So because this is communication, you have a message. And that is really the foundational concept of a scientific poster, is that you are trying to convey a message to your audience. And effective messages are clear, concise, credible, complete, consistent, and correct. And what do these things mean? Well, clear means that they're interpretable. And so that may mean that you're using the discipline-specific language that is appropriate to your audience, so that your audience really understands exactly what it is that you are trying to communicate. They are concise, meaning that, remember, this is an appetizer. I'm giving you an appetizer presentation, but the poster itself is also an appetizer. It's not meant to be a full course meal. It's not meant to be everything you did. This is not like the Hansel and Gretel story where they're following the breadcrumbs, but then they take a nap under this tree, and then they wander over to the lake, and they look at some birds, right? There's a precision to it, right? And you want to condense your message down into something that's easy to digest. Credible. Meaning you need to give enough information for your audience to believe that what you are telling them is true. So in a scientific paper, that involves methodology and, very importantly, clear description of your methodology so that another researcher can interpret for him or herself if they think that you did a good job with that work. So that doesn't mean that you have to put everything on the poster. It just means that you want what you put on the poster to enhance that feeling of credibility. You want it to be complete, not the whole story with the breadcrumbs over to the tree and then over to the lake, right? We're talking about that it's a complete unit, even if it's a small unit. You want it to be consistent. That means you're using the same terminology, you're keeping whatever that message is that you want to convey, that message, everything you have on that poster, relates back to that message. And then correct. You want to double check your work, make sure your math adds up. If you have a table and you have summarized things in a column on the one side, it should add up, right? So you want everything to be correct. And when do you start working on a poster? When do you start working on a manuscript? Anybody want to give me a date? What is the moment you start working on that?
Early as possible.
What's that?
As early as possible.
As early as possible, which means the day you start designing your study is the day that you actually start working on whatever your communication is going to be. So as you're really designing your study, think about who your audience is. Maybe you have multiple audiences. Maybe you need to think about a design that's going to capture information appropriate to each of those audiences. And then for a poster presentation, you're going to have probably a very specific and targeted audience. Now, for things like the Delta Omega poster competition, your audience is faculty and Delta Omega member alumni who are coming to do the judging. And that may be more general than a discipline-specific conference, but nonetheless it is an audience and a target that you have. The action, what is your message? What is the message of your research? And then what is that specific, generally smaller message for your poster? How do you best communicate that? And then the piece that a lot of people miss out on is the evaluation. So if you have opportunities to get evaluations from people on how you did in a poster presentation, that can help you make progress towards the next time you do it, that you'll be more effective in communicating your message. And there are many ways to do that. You can ask your peers to stop by and tell you what they think. Sometimes you can do it very formally. So we give formalized feedback as part of the Delta Omega poster competition because it's a career growth experience. So when we get to the graphic part and we're thinking about communication, you have a bunch of tools at your disposal, things you can use to really translate your message. And these can include color, typeface, the way you put everything together in terms of its design, the specific layout of the actual poster, and then the graphics that you insert. These are all tools that you can use. So let's talk about each of them. Color is like punctuation. You can use it to highlight important things, attract the eye, tell the reader where to go, tie everything together, organize it, and sometimes even generate emotion. So color tips. You want to be very consistent in your color. If I were designing a poster around, let's say, a Johns Hopkins blue theme, I would want to use that blue in the poster, and then maybe an accent color. I don't want to use this shade of blue over here, this other shade of blue over here, and this third shade of blue over here, because it's going to look a little bit disorganized. It's not going to come together the way I want it to. You don't want to use color in kind of an overwhelming way unless there's something about your message that would require that. So that's a rule that can be broken effectively, but rarely. So in general, use colors sparingly, because when you use color, it's going to point out elements that your reader or viewer should look at first. And then a tip is that you can use a color picker in many different programs that let you do graphic design. So you can use there's like a little dropper tool for Photoshop Elements, for example, and you can use that in order to pull a color out of an image. So let's say that you work in a laboratory and you have histology slides, which are, sections of tissue that have been stained, and so they can be really colorful. Some can be stained, and then you might use fluorescent antibodies to show up different elements. And so you might pull a color out of an image that's part of your poster. And you want that color that you pick from the image to be an important color. There are some caveats that I'll get to in just a minute. Colors have they generate not just emotion, but they sort of have a presence and a space on a poster. And so cool colors tend to recede. They just sort of tend to fade in the background. And so they're not bad if you want to put them in the background. They're not going to be very distracting. Warm colors advance. People notice them. They tend to kind of come forward out of the poster. Medium colors are, Goldilocks being right in the middle may not be the thing you want because they can have low legibility and they don't really do anything. They're just kind of neutral. Vibrant colors are colors that are so bright that when you look at them, literally your eyes kind of have this little vibration that sometimes happens if you stare at them too long. So kind of a fire engine red. Well, the reason fire engines in the United States are red is for a reason. They're very visible. But if you are looking at a poster, and remember, one of your goals may be to bring someone in to have a 3 to 5 minute conversation. And if they're staring at this fire engine red the entire time, that may be a little bit off-putting. It may be hard for them to navigate when you have a color that's kind of so bold. So try to go a little bit darker if you have too bright or fluorescent color. Pale colors, like the neutral tones, can also fade, especially in small formats. They work better on kind of very large formats. And then watch your red and green combinations because of people who may be colorblind. And what you can do if you need to use red and green, let's say that there is a reason that you're using those colors and that they have meaning, like red could be negative and green could be positive, you want to adjust them by at least 20% so that if you would print them in grayscale, there would be a 20% grayscale difference in the hue. And you can usually do that by going into a color wheel, and you can literally kind of drag that hue up and down, so the intensity of the color. So a very dark red and a very light green could be a good combination depending on your layout. There are color combinations that are more visible than others. And here's just a sampling of color combinations that have really good contrast. And this contrast improves legibility and readability, especially at a distance. So what do you notice about the far upper left combination? These are all H's, just to give you kind of a standard format. What do you notice about that? Where have you seen that before? What is it? It's, what color is the background?
Yellow.
Yellow, good. And what color is the font?
Black.
Black. So where have you seen yellow and black together?
The street.
On the street. Well, where?
Like driving stop signs.
Got road signs and school buses, right? It's because this is a very legible kind of format. So it may be helpful for you to think about the colors that you're putting together, what your background color is and what your font color is, because you want to enhance legibility, especially at a distance. And the other piece of legibility is your type and the type that you choose. So a couple of definitions. A family of type are all the variations of a particular typeface, and a font is a complete character set, meaning Times New Roman 28-point regular is a font. So you actually can't say Times New Roman font, right? That's the family. You would say Times New Roman 28-point regular. So when I use the term font and I say 2 to 3 fonts, I mean the size matters too, and the bold matters too. So you don't want to mix things up too much on a poster because it will just be a little bit jumbled. You want a nice, clear, consistent hierarchy. And type, just like color, can generate emotion and have what we might perceive as personality. So I have a couple examples here, and you can see that there's one that looks like it was written on a little chalkboard and sort of is more lighthearted than the typefaces that look a little more kind of stern and professional. So think about what personality you want your audience to perceive as they are looking at your poster. They're perceiving your personality through the font, right? So there are also these things, they're technically called cast-outs, just different ways of emphasizing words. You can use underlining, all caps, starting every word in a sentence with a capital, which is not recommended, using italics or bold or outline type. And when you use these cast-outs, you want to do so quite sparingly. Just like color, when you're using things to emphasize or point a reader, if everything's emphasized, does the reader know where to start? You want to do the decision-making for your audience. You want to give them a guide of how to go through your poster, and this is one strategy to do so. When you're working on a manuscript, you typically are going to set what's called the body copy, in other words, most of the manuscript, in 10 to 12 point font, right? But is that legible on a poster? No, it's far too small. And so you need to consider increasing the size of your font quite significantly for posters, and then additionally think about your audience. Children and older adults who may have visual impairment are going to benefit from larger type, right? So if you use a larger font, then they're going to have an easier time reading it. And so think about the demographic of the people, especially maybe the senior people you want to impress at a scientific conference, and do them a favor and make things really easy to read. Oh, and then if you use what I call a fancy font, there's these calligraphy swishy ones, right? Generally, they have more kind of narrow lineage within the font, and so you often need to go bigger than you would for a font like Helvetica or Arial that's kind of just a solid font that has a lot of substance to it. When you are orienting your text on a poster, make everything really clear. Show them where every section begins. For example, like if you are going to have paragraphs, which we'll talk about whether or not you should, make sure you either indent or you block style them, meaning that you have a solid block of text followed by leading, which is space between paragraphs, and then another block, so that's what I mean by block. By the way, it's called leading because these were actual pieces of lead, so it's spelled L-E-A-D-I-N-G, that were placed between the type when they were doing the letterpress kind of printing. So that's where leading comes from. It was actual strips of lead of different sizes. The easiest way to read, and this is useful, by the way, for theses and dissertations as well as for posters, is left justified. You might call it flush left, rag right, because I'm going to do it correctly for you guys. Okay, right? Is that correct? Okay. Because as you're reading, the lines are going to have slightly different lengths. And so even though everything will line up on the left-hand side, it will have like a ragged edge on the other side. This is actually the easiest to read and the fastest because when people are reading, we take a lot of shortcuts. So we look at the first and the last letter and the length of the word, and we make a snap judgment without looking at the rest of the letters as to what it is. If it's 3 letters, begins with a T and ends with an E, are you going to see the H in the? Probably not. you're just going to jump over a lot of these. And when you have things fully justified, you pull words out of proportion with each other. And so the spaces between them are more variable. And people often rely on those spaces between words being consistent to kind of skip ahead. So you can get marginally faster reading with left justify. So I'm on a campaign with all of my students. I'm like, just left justify. It's better, trust me. Look at the really, really fancy magazines. Most of them left justified. We used to have a convention where you had to do 2 spaces after a period, but with the advent of computers and the loss of the typewriter, that has completely gone away. It is now standard 1 space after a period. And then line lengths. If you are like in a manuscript or dissertation, you don't want them to be more than about 70 characters in length because it just gets tiring to kind of read all the way across, unless you're from a culture where you have much longer line lengths. So how many fonts do you pick? That's a question I get asked. And there's kind of this thin line between what's just boring. If everything were exactly the same font, Times New Roman 28-point regular, there would be no emphasis. There would be nothing for a reader to look at as a guidepost for where to go. So 1 is rarely enough. 2 is often really good, so a header and then body text. Usually people will throw in a 3rd font for their overarching title, and maybe 4 if they need to do something different within like a table system. And you want to think about point counterpoint. So font combinations are really important. So contrast is good. A lot of people like to say that you would select a serif typeface and then a sans serif, and one would be your header and the other would be in your body copy. And by serif, we mean fonts that have these little feet. You guys see those? So that would be like Times New Roman. And a sans serif has very clean lines with none of these little extra feet, and so that would be like Arial. So choosing combinations where 1 is your header font and 1 is your body copy can be very useful. You also want to combine fonts of similar proportions. And so here, what I've done is I have a bunch of different fonts, and even though they're different points, so the Times is 48 point, the Arial is 50 point, and the Courier is 60 point, what I've done is I've actually harmonized them so that they're the same height. Because proportion relates to the width of the character in relation to its height. And this is just to show you that the Times and the Arial have similar proportions, but Courier New does not. Courier New, by the way, is also very useful if you're doing data analysis, because everything it's a non-proportional font, meaning that the characters, when you put them next to each other, they each occupy exactly the same amount of space, whereas many fonts will adjust the spacing between different letter combinations. So like an I and an L might be very close to each other, but in Courier New, everything is exactly lined up. So if you're running code, and you want table output from, for example, data analysis, Courier New is how everything will line up for you. So that's part of why you'll see that particular font in certain settings related to data analysis. So for posters, typically you want big. So a rule of thumb is to put titles at least 85 points, subheadings 36, body text 24, and captions down at 18 or maybe a little bit smaller, depending on how close you want people to get to your poster. So if you're going to be in a gigantic exhibit hall, you may want to go bigger. If you're going to be in a smaller, more intimate setting, you may be able to get away with a slightly smaller grouping. And this will also depend, going back to the last slide, on the font, right? So each of these is the same height, but Times is 48 point and Courier is 60 point. So it's not like a strict rule. You want to actually look at what you have. And then the other thing about what proportions to put together There are some calculators online that will help you set up the ratios to be something that is kind of mathematically harmonious, which we often interpret as being more pleasing to see. So poster design, certainly in kind of a westernized setting, is going to navigate left to right, but you need to know your audience and you need to know what language you're using. So there are going to be other settings where you may want to navigate in different directions, but I'm just going to stick to the westernized approach here. Choose the most important element and make it dominant. Remember, this is an appetizer, right? So it's not like a full course meal. Make it a snack, not a banquet, and maybe that means scaling down what you're going to talk about on your poster. There are two main styles, wide and tall. Square is generally not something you want to do because if you don't make it absolutely perfectly square, people notice. They don't know why, but they know it's not quite right. So wide, you want to do 3 to 4 columns, tall 2 to 3. And then this gets us to design and layout. And if you really want to go deeper in design, pick up some good magazines. This is Johns Hopkins magazine from a number of years ago. And I'm going to give you one example out of that in just a moment. So what's the difference? Design is the overall look. So whatever that is, whether it's your poster, maybe it's your entire laboratory group, has a certain design, something that brings everything together. And then layout is the exact structure on the page. So you can have kind of a branded lab, you all use the same design, but then the layout on each of your posters may be different. And when you're thinking about how to put the poster together, do it on a grid. And a lot of programs can let you turn on grid lines, or they will have something called Snap to Grid, meaning that the software program will help line things up along these invisible lines that don't print. And so here's a really good use of grid. So in this case, and this is Johns Hopkins magazine again, you've got 3 columns, but the underlying grid is more nuanced, so that there are only a couple of grid lengths open on the left-hand side, the gutter right here, and then the other 2 are divided equally into equal text columns. And then there's an element that's been placed that is designed to be a little bit off the grid, and that's to attract your eye. So when you want to emphasize something, you can kind of break the grid. You don't have to follow an absolute kind of cookie cutter approach, but you don't want to do it for every element or it just looks cluttered. It doesn't look like there's a grid. So you want to set up the expectation of a pattern, and then you can break it for emphasis. Again, if you break it, that's going to be where people's eyes go. And so you want that to be really important, like your main finding. You do not want to do that for something that's just a secondary piece of what you're doing. White space is not a bad thing. Do not feel, I'm going to repeat this, do not feel like you have to fill every single inch or centimeter of your poster. It is fine. It lets people breathe. White space is an element of design and you should use it. The most important material is going to be in the upper left because most readers will start there and they will scan left to right. Position the least important material in the lower right-hand corner. And so, sorry funders, that's where I tend to put all of my funding acknowledgments because it's not necessarily central to what I'm doing. Unless I'm at a conference where I know my funders will be there, and then I may, or maybe it's put on by my funders, then I may want to rethink that decision making, right? And the most important element on the page is going to be the largest one in terms of your reader's perspective. So try to match their expectations. Couple of tips. I talked about font. Remember, you want everything to be consistent. So if you have an introduction, a methods, results, conclusion, all of those headers should be the exact same font, meaning the same family of type, the same size, and the same bold, not bold, whatever the cast outs are that you're using. Make columns larger than they're wide, wider than they're long, or exactly square. Remember, people pick up that nuance of it not being quite right if it's close to square. And then graphics can add punch. They can communicate like a picture speaks 1,000 words. People have gotten into doing those infographic kind of posters, and they can be very pleasing. They tend to keep people engaged as you're trying to communicate your message to them. And they can really kind of connect things together. So some people will use graphics in terms of replacing text with a graphic or a figure instead. But remember, you want to choose the right one. If you're using just any old graphic just to put a picture on your poster, it's not really part of your messaging. But because graphics attract the eye, you could be really missing out on an opportunity. So make sure that you really pick the right one. And the other thing is just be aware of copyright. You can't go to the internet and just download anything you want and use it, because it may be that there are restrictions on the use of that image. So make sure that if you're using an image that involves research, that you have full written patient disclosure, and that they've given you permission for this kind of use if you want to do that. I tend to avoid using participant photos on any kind of presentation or poster for that reason. I just assume confidentiality as a default. So if you're using a figure that maybe one of your colleagues has created, be sure that you have permission from them. Now that can be in an email, hey Sue, I was hoping to use this figure that you developed. I'm going to attribute it to you on the poster. You're a co-author on the poster. Still, is this okay with you? I just want to double check. Right? It's always better to ask permission. You want to try to think about what pictures you might want for presenting at the time that you're capturing it. So let's say you're in the laboratory and you're doing an image capture, or you're in the field and you're taking photos in the field. Think about what you're going to ultimately need to communicate your message later. And then be sure you captured it in the right format and in a size that's large enough for printing or displaying. And so there are many different formats. JPEG or PNG files are typically best for photos. GIFs are good for graphics. EPS are really good for kind of those higher resolution images. And you'll see a lot of logos from various institutions that you may want to put on your poster will be in EPS format as a result of that. Your goal is to get at least 300 dots per inch, DPI. And the reason is that that is going to be less likely to be fuzzy or pixelated when you print it on a larger poster. Now, if you're just talking about a website, if you're going to communicate in that format, 72 dots per inch is a standard for websites. So scientific graphics, I have this little asterisk by use color instead of black and white. The use color is definitely a sort of graphic design standard, an art standard, but in different fields, there may be different expectations. And so there are absolutely disciplines that tend to prefer black, white, grayscale images to color images. And so you really need to know your audience. Very important, use unaltered data. Let's say you're doing a Western blot and you are creating a composite image to put everything together. You cannot artificially enhance one of your lanes and not the rest. So if you do want to just improve the legibility overall, you can maybe do just a little bit of increased contrast, but then you need to disclose that and you need to apply it to all of the data points. So just be very careful with that. Make sure you discuss any alterations that you're making that are what you think are just for design purposes with your co-authors, and absolutely never alter things to mislead your audience. Make sure you choose images that enhance understanding. If you're doing something that everybody does, maybe it's just an endpoint PCR, or maybe you're doing a certain kind of data analysis, you may not need to show all your work there. You may be better off putting other more conclusive endpoint findings on your poster instead of kind of showing all of the different paths you took to get to that conclusion. And then again, make sure that you have your collaborators sign off on the poster. What to choose if you're going to use graphs? So vertical bar charts are useful for temporal changes, and horizontal bar charts can be a little bit more useful to compare quantities, but ultimately you're going to have discipline-specific standards and what your audience expects. Line charts are good for trends, and pie charts I only use quite rarely, because most of the time what you could convey in a pie chart could just as easily be conveyed in a table. And the pie chart may not enhance understanding. Now, the exceptions to that are when you really have interesting groupings that you can color group within a pie chart so that you can see how different maybe sections of a larger wedge can break down. Microbiome research is one example of a place where I tend to use pie charts or gradated bar charts in order to show abundances of hundreds of different taxa, which would not be very easy to show in a table. A couple of other just tips. Keep your text really concise. Use strong verbs, active voice. Follow the 6x6 rule. That means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points down, 6 words across. So that goes back to concise. You can bullet point within sections on a poster. Often with methods, I'll just have a bulleted list of the most important pieces, and I will use this kind of same standard that I might apply to a PowerPoint presentation to that section of my poster. Limit fonts to 2, 3 max. Use upper and lowercase text, not all cap, and not starting every word in a sentence with a capital letter. That slows your reader down. Every capital letter is an emphasis point, and every time you add emphasis, you're going to slow your reader down. Use bolder color if you want to emphasize. The presentation is just as important as the actual poster itself. So here I have a picture of one of our PhD grads from Hopkins sitting next to her poster. And so for the presentation, you should prepare for it. You should think about what you want to say. If you're someone who maybe struggles to be improvisational or to respond kind of in real time, you may want to practice a script. It's totally fine. Keep little note cards in your pocket though, try not to pull them out. Try to do all of that rehearsing ahead of time. And remember that you're telling a story. This is a nonfiction story, right? It's a true story, but nonetheless it is a story, meaning it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You're working towards a conclusion. You have characters. Maybe they're just the research team. Maybe they are the cells you're studying. Maybe they are your research participants. But nonetheless, if you can craft a narrative, you will do a better job of engaging your audience. And then rehearse. Find some people to practice with. The thing that you think is only going to take you 2 minutes to say may actually take you 5 minutes to say. And that's when you see, the people at your poster kind of twitching away, right? Like, but I need to go to 5 more posters and there are 10 minutes left, right? So remember, you want to engage with people, and if they want to come in and have a very detailed conversation with you, that's wonderful. And if they want to just get the conclusion that if you give it to them, they will actually thank you for being efficient and being able to move on so that they can get to all the posters they need to get to. So you're the extra element, and think about how you want to be coordinated with your poster. If your poster is one color and you're wearing a clashing color, that's not going to pull people in the same way that coordination will. You don't have to look just like your poster. That's not what I'm talking about. But you want to either wear something neutral or something that kind of pulls an element together from the color scheme that you picked. And then be ready and try to remember to smile and be enthusiastic, because you're part of this messaging. A poster is not about some static thing on the wall. It's an opportunity to network, and it's an important part of science. So let's talk about the science bit. So scope of work, I've said multiple times, this is an appetizer. So think about the scope. This is not a full manuscript distilled onto a poster. Generally, you're going to pick an important point, or maybe a sub-project. Something that would be a short communication is maybe a good sort of manuscript parallel for how much science you want to put onto a poster. So let's say that you've run 50 different experiments, or you've done all of these different analyses related to your research question. You may want to pull out the most important and have that be your messaging and the message you want to convey. And then make sure you have discussed that scope with your PI and collaborators, right? This is usually a group decision, or you might make a pitch to them and make sure they're okay with it. So the traditional sections, and I'm going to talk about newer and non-traditional approaches in just a minute, are just like a manuscript. Introduction or background, some people will pull out specifically a goal or aim section on a poster. Methods, results, conclusion or discussion, acknowledgments and funding, references, maybe contact information you want to have. Because someone may go past your poster and, it's not during the poster session, and they may look at it and want to get in touch with you. So you should have a way for them to do that. References are discipline specific, shall we say. There are some disciplines that you go to a poster session and no one has references on their poster. And then there are other ones where you have to have references on your poster. So if you're doing a Cochrane or systematic literature review, references are kind of the content that you're delivering. So it's going to depend on the work that you're doing and your audience. For the section construction, as I said, you can bullet it. That keeps things a little bit more brief, a little easier to read. And a lot of times people will block things off in different sections. You can do that, or you can use white space. It depends on what your overall goal is for the kind of communication you're doing. And people are going to start at the left and end up at the bottom right. And so you want your conclusions or your main point to either be that upper left or kind of right as they're finishing. But it's going to be more emphasized in the upper left. So here's just an example poster. I actually think this still has too much text on it. This is from a number of years ago, but it's to demonstrate the way you read a poster, right? So you start up here in the upper left, you read down here, and then you go to the top of the second column, you read down, and you go to the top of the third column, and you read down. And so a lot of times what you really want to make sure you do is if you have methods, keep them completed in your first column so that you can start with results at the top of your second column. Because people's eyes are going to go to the top more than they are going to go to the bottom. For the introduction and backgrounds, 1 to 3 important points, that's it. Put the research in the larger context. Why did you do it? What was your motivation? Make sure you include a goal statement, whether it's in a separate section or not. So you might actually list your aim or say goal and put a goal right there. You can emphasize that with bold text or color to help pull it out, to help people see why you did this work. Methods, unless your paper is about a method development, in which case the method is front and center, keep your methods brief. You can sometimes get away with smaller type. So your font could be smaller here. And then consider graphical methods, and here's just an example of a graphical methods that I did for a culture-based protocol. So rather than saying, we moved to this auger and then this other auger and then we did this thing, I just actually put the pictures of what it looked like. Results. Your most important findings should be first. You can bullet point these also. A lot of people use tables or figures for their result section and make each element completely interpretable on its own. This is also good for manuscripts. So if I have a table, I want to make sure I have a legend on that table that references all of the acronyms, or if there's any additional qualifiers I need to give, like, oh, these 3 columns had this much missingness. I might put in asterisks or some sort of superscript and then put that down in the legend. Remember that legend text can be smaller. Oh yeah. Include a title for every figure. If you have axes, label them. If you have rows and columns, please label them. Again, someone should be able to look at a table or figure on your poster and not look at anything else and be able to understand that element completely. So what goes where? What goes into your introduction versus your methods versus your results versus your conclusion? Same criteria as you would use for an original research article. And so you may follow guidelines. So STROBE is used for observational epi-studies, CONSORT for controlled trials, PRISMA for systematic reviews, and then I've been working on one called COHERE for One Health epi-studies. Again, whatever your field is, use the guideline that's most appropriate to what you're doing. And if your field doesn't have guidelines, you may want to look at some of these just to get an idea for what other disciplines do. And here's just an example of what the guidelines look like. They have different statements and recommendations related to location within the manuscript, and that would be perfectly parallel with a traditional poster. If you're interested in how you display your results, I strongly recommend the work of Edward Tufte, and you can actually go on his website that I've listed here, and he gives lots of tips for free on his website. He also has a series of books that are really handy. And I've distilled just a couple of things down for figures. Label your axes. Include your sample sizes. This is in particular for laboratory scientists. If you're running replicates of an experiment, please include your replicate number. These are really important for our interpretation of things like confidence intervals. Keep your color and your terminology consistent. Couple of don'ts, and if you're interested, various groups have mapped out what they thought are the worst figures ever, and you can Google and learn what people think bad figures look like. But I'll just say, don't make the message too complicated, unless, hey, this is a complicated system is your message, right? So confusograms have a place, they have an audience, but if you actually have a simple message, don't overcomplicate your figure. Try to avoid 3D unless 3D is really useful to your message. So for example, I only use 3D if I am projecting data in 3 different dimensions, where I'm actually showing maybe 3 different coordinates. So this could be microbiome data where I have 3 principal coordinates, or this could be displaying odds ratios with effect modification, so I have kind of that 3rd layer I want to add. But if I have 2-dimensional data, I don't display it in 3 dimensions. And then, as I said, pie charts have pros and cons. Your conclusion section should really emphasize important findings, should always include at least some nod to the limitations of your work, and you should generally in each of these sections, but particularly in conclusions, make fewer than 6 points. And here are the other sections that you can have. One thing to note is that depending on the conference and depending on the competition, some conferences and competitions, particularly for students, want to see a contribution of the presenting author. And so that would be a statement of what the author who's presenting actually did as far as the work goes. Because many times, and this is completely appropriate, we work within very large studies that have a lot of different pieces. And so maybe you didn't do the enrollment for that randomized controlled trial, but you did all of the data analysis for the research question you were asking within that data set. Does that make sense? So there's been a big movement gaining steam this year called #BetterPoster, and it's an emerging approach to poster design, and there are a couple variations on this, but this is probably the one that's gotten the most attention. And this is the model that's being used for the SciBar initiative here at Johns Hopkins. So if you're interested, there is a YouTube video that kind of outlines Mike Morrison's pitch for why we need to change poster design. And there's a whole Twitter thread that you can follow as well. But this is basically the format that has been kind of put forward for consideration. I think they're doing some validation of it as well. But the goal of this is really to try to make it possible for someone who is maybe an audience member or judge to to walk through a line of 30 posters and to get something from every single poster. And then to make it a little bit easier for the person who's presenting the poster to be able to attract in the people who are going to be interested in that work. So they'll see that main finding in plain English as a very important element in the poster. And so by putting, in this case, a very contrasting font against a dark background that's color-coded for some kind of research. So there's been a pitch that I think red should be methods and blue should be observational studies and green should be something else. I don't remember what the pitch is. But you can look at a poster and know that the color has a meaning and that you can read that main finding from a distance and know if you want to walk closer. And if you don't, you've gotten something out of that poster and you're walking on. And then this left-hand side is kind of the mini poster. It's the title, authors, and all of the regular sections. Introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And any extra content would go over here. So the pitch he makes is that the presenter's over here, next to the extra content, engaging with people who want to deeply engage in this work, and a casual reader would just come take a peek at this abbreviated section to the left. So that's the format. And there are various variations on this theme. So I was just at the International Society for Environmental Epidemiology, and this was the template that they gave to us. So having the conclusion in a color section just under the title. Now, I found it a little bit challenging because my titles tend to be my conclusion statement. Again, a little bit like the Better Poster movement, I want what's on my title to reflect exactly what I did and found in terms of the main finding. So I really had to jigger that one. A lot of posters are now also using QR codes. QR stands for Quick Response, and these are two-dimensional matrix barcodes. And scanning the code, usually with like a phone camera, automatically will link to the content. So let's see if I can make this work. Yeah, and it wants to open the link in Safari. So all I had to do was lift my camera and I could go to that content. And you can generate QR codes using a number of different programs out there. The main thing is you want to make sure that the content you build to link to is also approved by your co-authors and collaborators, does not include identifiable information from your participants, right? That it would also be presentation worthy. So it also has to go through the same kind of collaborator review as you would do for the manuscript in the poster itself. I actually use this on our posters to link to our laboratory website so that people can see the larger context of what it is that we're doing. Rule of thumb, a visitor to your poster should be able to get in and get out in 5 minutes or less. And there are some people who say 1 minute. And so I like to tell my students to prepare 3 talks for your poster. One is the 30-second to 1 minute version. The other is the 3-minute version. And the final one is what you say to that really cool person you want to collaborate with who has just set up shop next to you and is willing to go deep, right? So you want to have these different narratives, these different stories that you can trot out. And your default is probably going to be that really, really short elevator speech. If you can give someone exactly what they need in 30 seconds, they will think you did a great job, and they will appreciate the fact that they can now move on to the next poster. And you might trigger something, and they might end up staying for 20 minutes. Another tip, and again, people have different feelings about this, is to print copies of your poster to have for people to take away. And some conferences will restrict photography in poster sessions, so that you really need to understand the etiquette and the norms of your discipline and of that particular conference if you're multi or transdisciplinary the way I am. No matter what, make it easy for someone to take away your contact information. You're there to network. right? To get ideas about science and to maybe open up new collaborations. So there are a number of resources. As I said, all of these slides will be made available on the Delta Omega website. And you can Google Delta Omega Alpha poster, and you should be able to get to these. You can currently see the slides from 2013 with my mother, and ones we did just a number of years ago, but because of the Better Poster movement, we are recording again today. In terms of printing, check with your department. So sometimes people have to pay for printing, and in particular, if you want fabric, you have to pay for fabric. So here's just an example of a fabric poster that I did. And so the nice thing about fabric is that you can fold it up, and it can go into luggage, so very useful for international conferences where you don't want to necessarily have that rolled up piece of paper that's larger than life go with you through security and TSA. Pros and cons, these certainly, just like paper, are resource consuming, and some disciplines are now moving towards having everything electronic. But the startup cost for electronic boards is pretty high. And if you think about all of the metals and other components and energy that goes into that creation, you would need to have a lot of usage to kind of balance out the resource consumption. So there's no perfect solution yet, but this is one option that you have. When you're designing, there are a number of different software programs that work well. PowerPoint is probably the most common, and remember, you need to match your poster size. You change your poster size under File in Page Setup, and you can put the exact dimensions in metric or English, whichever you like. Poster, you can adjust that in PowerPoint. Some people will use Adobe Creative Suite, and either Illustrator or InDesign are very good for poster making. Other people will code in LaTeX, but you have to be pretty advanced to be able to get a whole poster out of that. The Delta Omega Poster Competition will be held this February. We typically open abstract submission in early January and close it in late January. We don't have the exact dates yet, but if you go to the Delta Omega Alpha Chapter poster website, you will find all of this information. The abstract is automatically accepted, so you don't need to worry about getting a, hey, you've been selected to participate. No, if you've submitted, you can present, and this is for everyone's learning. In addition, we have cash prizes. So there's potential cash reward, and the overall winner is sponsored to go to the American Public Health Association conference. So our last year's winner just won it. We have 3 categories: policy and practice, applied research, so epidemiology falls into that, and laboratory research, so any basic science would fall into that. If you're not sure, you can reach out to us, or you can make an executive decision of where you want to be, and we will generally, say that what you've decided is fine, and if we really feel like you would fit better somewhere else, we will suggest a move to a different category. And so we have prizes for each of these different categories. Look for the website to open, and if you have any questions, I am more than happy to stay and answer them now, or you can reach out to me by email later. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Anybody use Better Poster yet?
So Hopkins does not provide a template for posters for students.
Hopkins does not provide an explicit template, except the Better Poster template is now, I think, available for Sidebar. And that's because people in different disciplines have very different needs. A lot of times you can check with your own research group to see if there already is a poster template. And as I said, some conferences are now providing templates in order to help guide provision of content in a very similar way from one poster to the next, so that people are judged primarily on their science and less on their design.
I'm sorry, what is Sidebar?
That's an initiative that is put forward by the dean, who is trying to encourage multi- and transdisciplinary work within the School of Public Health. So they do have, they're requiring the better poster template for the sidebar posters, which will be presented, I think, on the 25th.
And that's SCIDAR.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Other questions? Any comments? So who's used Better Poster? Anybody? I know you three have to. We're requiring it for our departmental retreat this year. See how it works. Any other questions? If you have posters that you are developing for other conferences around the same time as Delta Omega, please feel free to recycle. In other words, yes, you may use the exact same poster in both Delta Omega and that other conference. We do not want things printed twice. Now, you may find that you come to Delta Omega and you get great feedback and you want to adjust your poster before you go on to the next conference, but otherwise, if you are happy with it, please feel free to use it for both.